Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 2 of online statistics. Want to give you a little bit of information here on regression. So, like last week, just a little kind of short bit on part of what we're talking about in this chapter. So please do make sure that you go through all the slides, right? You are responsible for the content of the chapter, right? And if you have questions on anything, please use that discussion board for regression and the activities for this week so that I know what we need to spend a little bit more time on. But briefly, right, related to this chapter and about regression, regression is all about prediction. We're still using correlation. It's still based on a set of data where we have X and Y pairs for all of our subjects, right? And so these concepts are closely related. Regression is a tool that we can use that uses the same basic idea of correlation. In fact, when you're doing regression, you're still running a correlation. You're just adding a little bit on top, right? So this is an example where we're looking at the relationship between body satisfaction and well-being. And this is where the data that you put on the X and Y axis gets really important. What you're trying to predict goes on the y-axis, and what you're using to predict it goes on the x-axis. So in this example, we're trying to use body satisfaction to predict someone's well-being, right? And so we can even look, right, if we wanted to predict based on our data, somebody with a body satisfaction rating of 3, we would predict that they have a well-being score of 4.44 based on the regression line that we have from this data, right? And even though we're talking about prediction at this point, it's still correlation based. We're not talking about any causal relationships that we might have here. So how that line gets positioned, that regression line, is in a way that minimizes the standard deviation of the residuals, right? So residual is something that you should be able to calculate. It's simply the difference between someone's actual score and their predicted score, right? So based on that line, you'll have a prediction for every X value that we have, and then you'll have people's actual scores, right? And so the residual is just the difference between their actual score and the score that that regression line would predict. Okay, so that line gets placed in a position that's going to minimize the overall standard deviation of the residuals. Don't need to worry too much about that. There's some math on these slides. You're not going to have to calculate the overall standard deviation of XY pairs, but you should be able to calculate residual. It's just the difference between someone's actual score and their predicted score. So you'll have practice with that in the activities and homework for this week. So thinking about the predictive value of these lines, right? Let's look at a couple examples. Let's imagine that you were trying to predict the GPA of some random student, right? If you didn't have another variable you were using to predict or no regression line, your best estimate would just be the mean of GPA in whatever population that you were talking about. If you had no other information, right? You might as well guess the mean because most people would be close theoretically to the mean, right? If we have a regression equation, for example, using something like height to predict GPA, as you might imagine, correlation there would probably be 0, right? There's no reason to assume that height would be related to GPA. And so in this example data, right, the regression line that we get has a slope of 0, right? The correlation there is nothing. And so in this case, right, we are essentially just using the mean of GPA as our predictor there. There's no value when R equals 0 to regression information. Now, if we look at B, right, this would be an example of a perfect predictor. In this case, nifty test, a made-up test, right, to predict GPA. We've kind of fixed it so that it's perfect in this case, right? In this case, when R equals 1, we know exactly everything that we need to know about GPA based on this score, right? Everybody falls perfectly on that line. X equals 90, we would predict a GPA 5.9, right? And they're right on that line. We would predict that perfectly. So these are the two extreme cases, right? R equals 0, no predictive information. R equals 1, perfect predictive information, right? Anywhere in between, right, it's going to be a little bit different, right? We're both knowing what the mean of y is and using the regression line are going to give us good information. So in this example, right, R equals 0.2, that's a small correlation, right? If we think about the cutoffs that we've used to interpret before, right? And because R is small, there's quite a lot of scatter, right, in our individual subjects in this case, right? So residuals are going to be pretty big. One other thing to think about in general is that because we're still using correlation, we want to be worried about the same things that we worry about when we're looking at correlations, right? You have to look at a scatter plot if you're running a regression in order to understand whether it's even appropriate to use regression to make predictions, right? We want to look for things like nonlinear relationships, floor or ceiling effects, really big outliers, right? All the types of things that could have a big impact on R and whether it's appropriate, right? Restriction of range would also be another thing to think about when we're looking at whether running a regression is appropriate, right? So really just trying to call your attention to pay attention to those same things that we think about when we look at correlations, right? Those are the basics. I'm going to post another video related to the regression activity, which is going to show you how to run regression in Jamovi. It's also going to remind you about that you should be able to create a scatter plot in Excel. I'm just going to show you how to add a regression line basically to that kind of plot, right? So if you have any questions in general on the regression chapter, right, especially after you go through the quiz, please post them on the discussion board so that we can use that so that everybody can get those benefits. All right, talk to you again soon. Otherwise, stay home, stay healthy, and we'll do our best.